The UK's National Drug Strategy mandates integrating recovery communities into every local treatment system. That directive traces back to Dame Carol Black's independent review of drugs, which prioritized peer-led initiatives as a core component of long-term rehabilitation. To understand how this plays out, we need to define the Lived Experience Recovery Organization, or LARO. A true LARO is a peer-led, independent entity run collectively by people in recovery. It is entirely distinct from a peer-delivered service. Employing a peer support worker inside a statutory healthcare provider does not meet the standard. LAROs require structural autonomy. They operate outside the clinical hierarchy. This map shows the distribution of these organizations across England. Despite national funding, 61% of counties and unitary authorities lack a recognized LARO. Integration is heavily skewed. Dense clusters exist in the Northwest and Yorkshire, while the South and West remain blank. When surveyed, 41% of local commissioners incorrectly identified the LARO status in their own area. Many reported having a LARO when they actually only had peer-delivered staff, a confusion that effectively blocks targeted investment. Fulfilling the national mandate depends on solving a structural conflict, embedding a fluid, grassroots community into the rigid architecture of a statutory health system. We can map this conflict by looking at the baseline architecture of a standard clinical ecosystem. We will call this the Type 1 model. It consists of 3 operational nodes: the local authority, the treatment provider, and the local community. Resources and statutory mandates flow in one direction. The local authority commissions a service, and that provider delivers clinical care down to the community. This downward flow of capital is designed for clinical delivery, but it hits a wall when encountering the specific requirements of a LARO. LAROs require pre-existing recovery capital. They rely on local individuals who are already in long-term recovery to organize, lead, and sustain the network. Statutory commissioners cannot artificially manufacture an organic grassroots network where that specific human infrastructure does not exist. Furthermore, strained statutory providers are often consumed with hitting traditional clinical volume targets, pushing lived experience integration to the bottom of their priority list. Top-down clinical systems are structurally unsuited to sparking bottom-up community networks. When the organic foundation is missing, the result is the void covering 61% of the map. Where we do see peer-led integration, it most frequently takes the form of a Type 2 ecosystem. The LARO emerges organically from the grassroots. This node operates independently of the clinical hierarchy, building momentum through horizontal community relationships, disconnected from the local authority's funding streams above. This autonomy creates an immediate financial vulnerability. Type 2 models survive almost entirely on precarious, short-term grants and volunteer labor. To secure sustainable capital, these independent LAROs must eventually enter the local authority's competitive tendering process. But competitive tendering favors massive clinical providers. Large corporations can absorb the complex administrative overhead of the bidding process and operate on lower wage margins. Pitting these 2 nodes against each other for the same contracts forces grassroots organizations and clinical providers into antagonistic relationships, eroding the trust required for future collaboration. Requiring fragile community networks to compete in a procurement market built from massive healthcare corporations guarantees the starvation of the peer-led model. A local authority attempting to bypass this friction might generate a Type 3 ecosystem, intentionally initiating and funding the LARO from the top down. This delivers immediate financial stability and ensures the organization aligns directly with local governance strategies. The risk here is cultural. A LARO manufactured by the state risks being rejected by the community as top-down tokenism rather than genuine peer representation. In some cases, large clinical systems manufacture these lived experience entities cynically, creating what insiders call bid candy, superficial additions designed entirely to win strategic national funding. This leads to the Type 4 ecosystem, where a LARO is incubated directly inside the treatment provider. Intense friction occurs the moment this internal group attempts to break away and establish itself as a fully independent entity. Clinical providers display a structural reluctance to relinquish funding and control to former patients, refusing to cut the apron strings. Clinical staff are trained in formal protocols. They frequently view lived experience workers through a lens of risk management rather than as operational equals. This baseline lack of trust traps the incubated Laro in a subservient role, preventing it from achieving true, peer-led legitimacy in the eyes of the wider community. When statutory systems attempt to engineer grassroots structures, their inherent mandate to control risk inevitably suffocates the autonomy that makes the Laro function in the first place. Underpinning the structural friction across all four models is a direct philosophical collision between peer-led values and statutory treatment mandates. Laros operate on highly relational, flexible community engagement. Statutory treatment services are built on rigid, hierarchical procedures and strict codes of conduct. This divide extends to the pathways of recovery itself. Clinical care often focuses on medicalized harm reduction models. Peer communities frequently anchor themselves in abstinence-based approaches. This abstinence-based philosophy draws heavily on historic mutual aid frameworks, prioritizing shared lived experience and personal accountability over clinical intervention. Lero culture holds a deep-seated aversion to clinical surveillance. They resist forced data tracking and traditional key performance indicators that define statutory healthcare. The quantitative metrics demanded by national treatment databases focus on specific clinical thresholds. They cannot measure the preventative, qualitative community support that Leros actually provide. Assessing the efficacy of an organic grassroots community using the rigid metrics of a hospital ward guarantees a systemic failure of evaluation. Scaling out to the macro, nationwide view clarifies the requirements for Lero survival. The data shows that while some nodes form highly resilient, interconnected regional clusters, a substantial minority float entirely isolated from peer support networks. Structural isolation is a critical failure state. Leros cannot survive long-term when nested as isolated subcontractors beneath larger clinical providers. Subcontracting inherently obscures a Lero's impact. It severs their connection to the true source of funding and locks them out of strategic power. Building a successful autonomous ecosystem requires specific structural mechanics. The first is bypassing the clinical provider entirely. Commissioners must utilize direct commissioning via ring-fenced allocations. This guarantees the financial independence of the peer-led organization. The second mechanism is formal inclusion in local governance structures, placing the Lero directly on boards like combating drugs partnerships. Securing a seat at the strategic table protects the grassroots organization from being absorbed, marginalized, or outcompeted by treatment provider monopolies. To successfully operationalize lived experience, statutory health systems must relinquish total operational control. They must tolerate diverse recovery philosophies and fund qualitative community impact directly at the source.